Facepalm America, I'm Beowulf Rockland, at Facepalm USA on Twitter. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia continues. I don't have a whole lot to say about it. Again, go to your up-to-the-minute news sources, whichever ones you choose, hopefully the trustworthy ones. But I will mention this. I'm not sure whether it's good news or not, but McDonald's is closing 850 restaurants in Russia, at least temporarily. They announced by press release that they're going to be suspending operations in Russia temporarily, closing their restaurants throughout the country because of its invasion of Ukraine. CEO Chris Kempczynski, a suspiciously Russian-sounding name, originally sent the announcement to McDonald's employees and franchises detailing the fast food chain's decision and how the company is dealing with the crisis in Ukraine. Kempczynski said in his letter, McDonald's has decided to temporarily close all our restaurants in Russia and pause all operations in the market. The McDonald's CEO also said that the company will continue to pay its 62,000 Russian employees their full salaries while the establishments remain closed. The company also said that it will continue paying its Ukrainian employees their full salaries as the Russian invasion continues. You know, it's interesting. I was browsing Google Maps, as I sometimes do, because I have ancestors who come from Ukraine, who come from the city of Odessa. And I was looking around the city on Google Maps, scanning for the famed Odessa Steps. I guess they're officially called the Potemkin Steps for those of you who delve into the history of cinema and have seen the film by Sergei Eisenstein, Battleship Potemkin. Pretty well-known sequence with the baby carriage rolling down the steps and all that. And there are several McDonald's in the city of Odessa. At this time, to the best of my knowledge, it has not been attacked or at least overrun by Russian forces. And so presumably those Ukrainian McDonald's outlets in Odessa would remain open at this time. No specific information about that. I have mixed feelings about this. I mean, I'm glad as a corporate decision that McDonald's is doing this. But I also feel like if those soldiers, those Russian troops, were eating McDonald's food, were laden with greasy burgers and fries, that they might fight a little bit less effectively. And so maybe they should consider keeping the Russian McDonald's open. Not sure. Just something to think about. What I mostly want to talk about today is voting. As you know, certainly if you have listened to this program before, the Republican Party, the conservative far right of the party anyway, which at this point is the controlling, dominant, and predominant faction of that party, as led by Donald Trump, is doing everything that it can to prevent people, or at least what it thinks are the right people or wrong people, from voting. They're passing laws in whatever states they have control over to make it more difficult to vote, to pull back the laws and regulations that were put in place in 2020 when the COVID pandemic began that allowed excuse-free absentee voting. Why you should need an excuse to vote by mail is beyond me. Why you should ever have to do that. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact that there are powerful people far-right people who don't want people to vote, for whom voting is not useful. They don't want it to happen. When people vote, they lose. When fewer people vote, they tend to win. That's the bottom line. And this has been tried recently. Well, I guess an impact of that kind of rule, I should say instead, has come to light recently in the state of Tennessee. You remember Tennessee and what our former president George W. Bush said about it, don't you?
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, "Fool me once, shame on you." If fool me, we can't get fooled again.
Or something like that. Fool me twice, shame on me. I guess that's what we should all be saying with regard to trying to restrict voting. We should all be on high alert to this, at least, until we're invaded. But in Tennessee, in Memphis, a judge has ordered a new trial for a woman named Pamela Moses. Who is Pamela Moses, you ask? She is a woman who is sentenced to 6 years in prison, not for voting or voting illegally, but for trying to register to vote in Tennessee. As you might have guessed, Pamela Moses is an African-American woman. She has been, or had been, in prison since December, when her bond was revoked. On Thursday of when this story was written, it was a couple of weeks ago, it was revealed that there was new evidence in the case that was not produced at trial. And Moses was released from custody, according to her attorney. Now let's get into the details of her case. Listen to this. I think you'll find it fascinating and galling. Moses was convicted last year for submitting a document in 2019 indicating she was available to vote. She was eligible to vote, rather. Prosecutors claimed she knew this was false because just months before, a judge issued an order telling Moses she was still on probation for a 2015 felony. In Tennessee, people on felony probation cannot vote. Because I guess I have no rights. You can debate about that, but I think that's silly and ridiculous. When Moses turned in the form, Moses believed that the probation for her 2015 felony had expired, and a probation officer signed a certificate indicating that that was the case, that the probation had expired, and that she was eligible to vote. So the probation officer signed off on that. Prosecutors said Moses deceived the officer into signing the certificate. Of course. She's cunning. She's deceptive. What absolute bullshit. What absolute bullshit. That's the presumption about anyone who has had a criminal record or is African American in certain parts of this country. But new evidence showed that corrections officials investigated the error immediately and determined that the probation officer, identified as Manager Billington, that's a name for you, manager. I suppose you have a certain set of expectations for their future when you name a child Manager Billington. I guess you can expect them to grow up and become a probation officer. So the investigation determined that the probation officer, Manager Billington, was negligent and made an error while Moses waited in the lobby of his office. W. Mark Ward, the judge who oversaw the case and sentenced Moses, cited the prosecution's failure to disclose the letter, even if it was inadvertent. Oh, of course. They did by accident. They failed to disclose key evidence in a case by accident. It was a mistake. It was an error. It was an accident. Whoopsie. Sorry. You tried to vote. We deprived you of freedom. Our bad. And that was one of the reasons the judge is ordering a new trial. Now, that ruling was a wee bit of a reversal for Judge W. Mark Ward, who, during the sentencing hearing earlier, when she was deprived of her liberty, yelled at Moses' lawyer and said she tricked the probation officer. Prosecutors can now decide to appeal Ward's order, retry the case, or drop the charges. We don't know what's going to happen yet. But this is the kind of thing that goes on in America when the wrong kind of people try to vote. That's what happens. That's what happens, Larry. You see what happens? That's what happens when you vote for a stranger in the Alps. There are new ways of doing voting, however. New and more democratic and more helpful ways. Ways that get around our entrenched political system. And in a moment, we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be speaking to a gentleman by the name of Rob Richie. He's the president and CEO of FairVote, a nonpartisan organization that seeks better elections in America. And he's going to be talking about ranked choice voting. Now, you may have heard of this. It is where you not only vote for one candidate, but you vote for the candidates in order of your choice. You give your first choice and then your second choice so that if no one gets a majority, then there's different automatic rounds of revote based on the selections that you've made. We'll get into the details of it, but I want you to listen to this because I think this is a fascinating and innovative way of approaching some of the difficulties we have around voting in this country. We will be back in a moment to have that discussion. I want to welcome to Facepalm America, Rob Richie. He is the president and CEO of FairVote. They're a nonpartisan organization. They're trying to get us better elections. They research and advance voting reforms that make democracy more functional and representative for Americans. That is their goal. Rob, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be on the program. I really look forward to diving into all of this topics.
So tell us about Alaska and what they passed in terms of ranked choice voting. It's an interesting concept, and we'll delve into the details a little bit. But knowing that Alaska, at least broadly, stereotypically, is the state of Sarah Palin, one doesn't typically think of them in terms of voting innovations, but it's really quite something that they've done here, isn't it?
It is. It's a really a trailblazing approach to how to vote in the United States, not just with ranked choice voting, which has a much longer track record. It's actually used for all of Maine's big federal elections, president, U.S. Senate, and House, and so on. It is and used in more than 50 cities. New York City used it last year, and so on. What they are adding to the package in Alaska is a change to the primaries that kind of melds what they do in California with what they do in Maine. So in the first round, back in August, or in this case coming up in August, all the candidates will run on the same ballot together for each office, for U.S. Senate, U.S. House, and governor. And people will go and vote for one. They could vote for a Democrat in one contest, a Republican in another, and so on. And then they add up the votes, and then the candidates, the top four candidates in each race, will then advance to the November ballot. They do something like that in California and in Washington State, and they just advance the top two. So in this case, they're advancing four, and they will allow people to do a write-in if for some reason voters don't like any of those four choices. And then they will use ranked choice voting because they'll have more than two people. And if you didn't use ranked choice voting, if you just voted for one, the top candidate might only have like 28% or some low share of the vote. So ranked choice voting is a mechanism that helps deliver a majority outcome, even when you have more than two candidates, and that's proven to successfully do that. So what you're basically doing is creating a much more open first round, and then this new November dynamic where there'll be this mix of candidates from across the spectrum. Voters can rank, and they'll find the candidate that has the strongest majority support among those four. And so it'll give voters a lot more choices. It'll make the candidates have to really work hard to connect with as many voters as possible. I don't know if that particular model is going to work in every state, but I think it's a very sensible one for Alaska, because even with that, that image that some people might have of it, it's a very independent-minded state. It's had independent governors. Actually, two candidates outside the major parties have won as governors in the last 3 decades. They have a kind of a political system where some Democrats work with Republicans and vice versa in a way that's pretty different than other states. And so I think this system really fits Alaska well.
Interesting. And so what is the outcome tend to be when you have ranked choice voting? I guess I mean typically in a primary system. If you're talking about what Alaska has done here, the primaries are controlled by the individual parties, and so you have a much smaller voting base, and typically the more activist voters, and a system that's controlled by powerful people within the party. So that tends to, I would assume, both tend towards the more extreme outcomes in terms of those who make it into the general election, and then also those who serve more powerful interests. And ranked choice voting tends to mitigate that. Is that correct?
Let me split this out a little bit. First, why don't we talk very quickly just about ranked choice voting?
Sure.
So we understand how that fits into this broader puzzle. So the ranked choice voting system actually goes back more than a century. It's used for some national elections elsewhere. We haven't moved it as quickly in the United States as some other places because of our voting equipment. We vote on machines, and a lot of other countries that use this count ballots by hand. And the machines that we were using to count ballots didn't easily allow voters to express rankings on a ballot and then be able to do the ranked choice system. So that kind of slowed its progress here. But what we've seen during the 30 years that FairVote's worked on this is where we really got a lot of traction as an idea back in the 90s, like when Ross Perot was running for president and creating a whole conversation about more than just the major party candidates running, but we just didn't have a good way to translate this into actual voting rules and voting systems in cities and states. Finally, we began to break through about 20 years ago. It started winning in cities, and then we're now up to 50 cities. So what it's doing is on its most basic level, and why I think it's just in some ways so sensible and become, I'd say, the most popular new reform out there, is that voters no longer have to just tick one box, tick a single candidate, but they can say, well, here's my first choice, here's my second choice, here's my third choice. And that's what's different for our voters, but it's something that often reflects the way we're experiencing a contest. Like you're already in your own mind beginning to kind of put candidates in a certain order, and this allows you to just show that, show your views. So it's more expressive for voters. And then those rankings are used to allow a simulation of a traditional runoff election. So in a traditional runoff election, everyone runs in the first round. The top two candidates advance to a second round, and then there's just a head-to-head contest. When you do a ranking, your first choice goes all in. Your ballot goes all in for that candidate. But if that candidate's not very strong, it basically doesn't make the runoff, and then that candidate is dropped from the contest, and your ballot counts for your second choice. So you have the last candidate drops out, the ballots go to their next choice, and you do that until you have that head-to-head, and then you get to see what's sort of an instant runoff. So that any time there's ever been a conversation that you might have been part of where it's like, well, I kind of like that third party, or I like that candidate who seems like a long shot, but I don't think they can win, and I don't want to throw my vote away. I don't want to waste my vote. No, and that candidate maybe is just a spoiler, and we'll kind of change the outcome just by running. Ranked choice voting eliminates that whole conversation, allows people to vote they really want, and then creates incentives for the candidates to engage with more voters, because you now not only need to be first choices, but you might need to depend on being the second or third choice rank of backers of another candidate. So you just have to get to know more people that you're ultimately going to represent. So it sort of solves the third party, quote unquote, spoiler problem, creates positive incentives for candidates, does practical things in our contests, like cities with runoff elections can save money and just have a shorter, cheaper, better election. And that's part of the Alaska package. So that's what you get from having those four candidates running in a ranked choice voting contest in November, and there can be like an independent or two Democrats or two Republicans, or kind of a mix of choices, and the new voting method kind of sorts that out and delivers a representative outcome. That's kind of the ranked choice voting piece. The primary piece is kind of an interesting one based on American history. The first century or so of U.S. elections, we didn't have any primaries, right? So the parties just picked candidates or rallied around candidates, and whoever they came up with through some private conversation or private organizing or convention or caucuses or whatever they did, put forward a candidate. But that often felt like just a relatively small group of people set the table for everyone else. So the primary system was put in the early 1900s kind of as an innovation to open that choice up to more party backers. What we're seeing today is even when you open that up to more party backers, it's still a pretty small number of people, right? Which you were pointing out, right? It's still a relatively small group of people that kind of picks the choices. They might not be a very representative set of people. And then those who haven't been active in the primary or sort of come to the general election ballot, and the only things that we get to pick among are kind of the candidates that have been vetted by the primaries. So there is a whole conversation to have about what's the best way to really open up our ballots, and there's a different way to do it. The Alaska approach is definitely a way to try to do this. It does functionally create something really important, which is now in the November election ballot, sort of a range of substantive candidates from kind of across the spectrum can have advanced out of that first round and give the general election voter that kind of greater choice. And then the ranked choice voting feature kicks in, and we have those more positive incentives for better campaigns.
So if I step into a ballot box, ballot booth in Alaska, or in Oregon, if a ranked choice were to come here, I open my ballot envelope that I get in the mail for a general election, and I have ranked choice voting. What does it look like, and what's the process? That I guess it varies from state to state, but what typically is it going to look like?
Yeah. Well, if you were in some other country like Australia that has used this for more than a century, you'd actually just see the list of candidates, a little box by each candidate's name, and you would fill in a number next to the box, like number 1, number 2, number 3, and you're putting your rankings in that way. We vote on voting equipment, or we vote on paper, and then that ballot is scanned. So we need a nice simple ballot design. the ballot design that really has been now shown to work exceptionally well. Like I'll give an example. Utah cities are starting to really move toward ranked choice voting. We have 23 cities have their city council vote to use ranked choice voting last year, and ultimately 21 of them had enough candidates to do it. And so they all had a ballot like this. So they'd list the candidates on the left, right, and then there'd be a first column, and that's the first choice column, and there'll be little bubbles by the name of each candidate. And then you fill in a bubble next to your first choice, and that's your first choice pick. And then there'd be a second column with the second choice column, and then you fill in a bubble next to your second choice pick. So they rolled that out in Utah. First time out of the box, 99.9% of voters cast a valid ballot, and about 90% of people ranked in at least one of their contests. So the very first time out, they showed they wanted to do it, right? They actually used their rankings, and almost nobody made a mistake that disqualified their ballot from counting. And then on the flip side, the candidates now have this new incentive to talk to more voters and so on. And so the people who win these ranked choice voting contests, and I'll keep Utah as a good example, the people winning generally were ranked either first, second, or third, say in a mayoral race, like kind of about 70% of the voters. So they had done something to make a connection with 70% of people or more, so that they actually got an affirmative expression of support from them. And that really, I think, creates a positive way of campaigning and handles voter choice and kind of embraces voter choice, which I think a lot of voters are eager to have.
So you mentioned this has been put in place in about 50 cities across the United States, including New York City. Maine and Alaska have it in place. What other states may be on the verge of adopting this as well?
Well, it's fun to see how much interest has grown. This is, in some ways, a quote-unquote overnight success that's built on a long history of foundation building for this moment. But like this year, I think we're up to about half of the states have a pro-ranked choice voting bill. It was more than 30 did last year. Not all of these are sweeping bills to say implement it for governor and president, but there are things to expand local options or use it for presidential primaries. That's a particularly there's a lot of interest just in that use, for people who have experienced our presidential primaries in recent cycles. A whole lot of people tend to run, and when you've got a lot of people running for president in a primary, people tend to get to know the candidates, and they're ready to rank, and ranked choice voting really makes a lot more of their votes count. So I think we'll have to see. There's bills that have looked very promising in a mix of states, and so if people go to FairVote.org, they can see the state legislative tab. The Alaska approach in particular, this kind of top four model. There's some people try to or are interested in advancing more than four, like maybe five, and they call it the final five. But they're basically the same concept of an open first round primary, then a certain number of candidates advance. That may be on the ballot this year in Missouri. There's also an effort moving forward with that particular approach in Nevada. And then again, a whole lot of states are looking at state legislation.
I had read something about Tennessee actually introducing an anti-ranked choice voting bill. What's the story behind that?
Yeah, that was disappointing, and it's actually on the governor's desk as we speak today, and we'll see what he does. Pretty good bet that he signs it. And that would actually prohibit cities from using ranked choice voting. We see a lot of momentum for using ranked choice voting in cities, and say Utah, which is a Republican state. Right. There's just a big explosion of growth of ranked choice voting. Tennessee, one of their big cities, Memphis, had voted to go to ranked choice voting years ago. And they've been in this ongoing sort of struggle, those who like the system, to kind of get through the election official, election administration, regulation sort of issues there in Tennessee. And some folks in the statewide elections office really didn't seem to want this to happen in Memphis, and have successfully blocked it to date. It looked like they were out of options for blocking it. And so sadly, they seem to have decided to to convince some allies in the legislature to preempt local control and actually take away the right for Memphis voters to get what they voted for. They had 71% of Memphis voters voted to use ranked choice voting, but the legislature seems to think they know best, and they are blocking that. But we'll see if that sticks. I think it's a really bad policy decision, and I think there's a conversation that can still happen in Tennessee moving forward. But obviously, the governor signs that bill, it'll clearly be a setback for the time being there.
Rob, I know there have been. I mean, we're talking about a broad swath, different cities, different states across the country, but at least just focusing on the United States for now, because internationally it's much bigger than that. But where a locality, a municipality, or a state has switched from traditional quote-unquote voting to a ranked choice voting system, what do we see in terms of the kind of candidates who come out of that system, who are elected to public office? Do we see a before and after picture of any kind?
It's always tricky to promise outcomes from an election system change like this. It's I know it's kind of like saying, if the voter turnout rises by 15%, is that going to help one side or the other, or one kind of candidate versus another? I think what it is doing is just making a lot more people involved, and more people have a chance to be part of that consent of the governed. And I think that's what ranked choice voting is fundamentally doing. Like, more of our votes are counting, more of our votes are effective, because sometimes your first choice is not a very strong candidate, and now you get a backup. By removing the whole quote-unquote spoiler conversation, it's at least allowing third parties and independents in general elections to participate without that critique, like without that attack that, you're running and you're just going to split the vote. So
or you're just throwing your vote away by voting for a third party.
You're just throwing your vote away, right? We started back in the early 90s, and our founding chair was a guy named John Anderson, and he had run for president as an independent in 1980, and he was very familiar with that, and just had an op-ed in the first year in 1992 in the New York Times saying, hey, Ross Perot is running for president, and we should have ranked choice voting, and it would be a very different, we could just talk about the candidates and not just talk about it through the horse race impact. And so that's quite liberating. So Maine has used it for general elections now for a couple cycles. And, it's still kind of a relatively modest impact, but their independent candidates get to participate in debates. Like, there was a big U.S. Senate race with Susan Collins in 2020, and there was a couple independent candidates, and they could be in the debates, and people didn't point fingers at them for being there. And, that's healthy for our politics. You do see, and you can really get a good feel for it when you talk to candidates at a local level, and that's where most of the uses have been. But candidates will be the first to tell you, right, that it changes how they think about their voters, right? They don't just discard someone because they hear from that person that they're going to support someone else. So, in a very literal sense, a candidate for city council will walk right past a yard sign for one of their opponents and knock on the door and have a conversation, because getting their second choice might be the difference for winning or not, right? So it sort of extends the conversation. And there's some ways to quantify that. There was some good studies about whether you can actually measure whether voters are experiencing these campaigns as more substantive and civil. And it's not, a night and day difference, but they definitely are experiencing campaigns that way. And then you measure what's just happening with voters. And winners are making that connection to more of the people that they're going to represent, and they do tend to, get ranked highly by, 65, 70, 75% of the voters in, kind of a big mayoral campaign. There are some fascinating outcomes that we'll just have to see exactly what's going on. But for instance, women remain very underrepresented in our politics, and in the ranked choice voting cities, and we're now up to a pretty big number of them, women hold about half of the city council and mayoral offices, and those represent big jumps from what was there before. And it seems like it just kind of liberates people from conventional thinking, or conventional wisdom about how to evaluate someone. and they can just vote the way they really feel about the candidates and not sort of say, oh, that's the one who's supposed to win or whatever it might be. So candidates seem to be more ready to throw their hat in the ring. Voters are more ready to give new voices and new perspectives a chance. And whether they win or not, they're at least part of the campaign, and I think making our representative democracy stronger.
Yeah, well, it does seem to provide an alternative to the traditional bifurcated political system in the United States, and also kind of provide a practical basis for engagement across the political spectrum, because you can't just run by appealing to a very small portion of the electorate and hoping another bulk will just go along and planning on pissing off a set portion of the people who are voting. You really have to work to engage, to work to bring people on, because that might be critical in the final analysis for you as a candidate.
Yeah, and sort of an interesting thing, you can't be a creature of just one part of the spectrum, right, but you also do need to think about that part of the spectrum, right? So you do need to find some way to connect with people, right? So it's kind of like a positive incentive in that you do want to show that you're listening to as many people as possible, by creating, the broadest pool of potential support. And you have to stand for something, because you're not going to win if you're not a good number of people's first choice. Like getting first choice support matters, but being respectful and looking for connections with more people matters too. I'll share, by the way, that just for those interested in rules and systems and where we might be going, if they go to FairVote.org and go to our write-up on the Fair Representation Act, there's a bill in Congress that kind of takes it a next step forward, which is to say, okay, you want to open up the ballot, being able to rank candidates instead of be limited to just one, that's liberating and does good things. In kind of a similar way, being limited to only one person representing you in a whole area, just having a single person representing you, even if a lot of people in that area don't all agree on something, right? And they have to just be limited to a single representative. You can move to combine districts into bigger ones and then have more than one person representing you. Also use ranked choice voting, and then you start actually changing who wins and loses as far as different parts of the spectrum actually getting their fair share of seats. And that's something that can be done by statute. The bill in Congress, the Fair Representation Act, is a bill that could Congress could pass out. And the whole gerrymandering crisis that we're in, where there's so few districts where both parties have any chance to compete, and let alone third parties and independents. This is a way that sort of takes it to the next step of kind of opening up our representative bodies to being more representative, really in a way that does affect outcomes. And that's where we want to land ultimately, and in how we change U.S. House elections. And that's something that we think, given the depths of our challenges as a country, that we'll actually begin to talk quite seriously about that too. So Alaska's kind of setting a really valuable model. You add in some other elements that comes, I think, really powerful and transformative.
Yeah, it certainly reverses or helps to reverse the trend of politicians cutting us up into separate districts that are, bizarre and, separating us from each other politically. And this, I think, brings us closer together politically. We've been speaking with Rob Richie. He is the president and CEO of FairVote. To find out more about this and also a list of cities and states and municipalities across the country that do have ranked choice voting and information about where this is being tried, you can go to fairvote.org. Rob, thanks so much for being with us today. A real pleasure, and best of luck with everything.
Thank you, Beowulf. I really appreciate the conversation.
Hey there, fellow working class heroes. I'm Rick Smith, host of The Rick Smith Show. Are you tired of the corporate-controlled media ignoring the needs of we the people? The people who actually do the work? Are you tired of the platitudes that they throw at us? Remember when they called us patriotic, frontline heroes, essential, only to find out that they've lined their pockets with the fruits of our sacrifice and labor? Had enough? It's time to come together, organize, and unite. Join us at The Rick Smith Show daily by downloading the podcast each and every day. Subscribe so you never miss a minute. The Rick Smith Show podcast is found wherever you get your podcasts, from iTunes to iHeart, Stitcher to Podbean, and beyond. Go to thericksmithshow.com for more information on how you can get the podcast each and every day. The Rick Smith Show, where working people come to talk.
So, there are some interesting possibilities for the future of voting in the United States. And a lot of places in the country are already taking it up, already taking ranked choice voting up. But the far right in this country, especially in the wake of the 2020 election, which so many right-wingers claim was stolen from Donald Trump, who continue to lie and perpetrate that lie, they're doing everything they can to stop people from voting. Everything they can. We've already heard about Tennessee, what they did there to Pamela Moses. And it's happening in Arizona too, because the Republican Party there is asking the state Supreme Court to strike down the vote-by-mail system. You know, the one that's used by 90% of voters in that state. 90% of voters in Arizona used vote by mail in 2020. They love it. It's convenient. It's good. It helps more people vote. And that's why the Arizona Republican Party hates it, because they don't want people to vote. They want as few people to vote as possible. The lawsuit filed argues absentee voting is unconstitutional and asks the justices to get rid of it, or at least eliminate the no-excuse absentee balloting system Arizona adopted in 1991. No excuse. Of course you shouldn't have to have an excuse. Make it easy, for God's sake. Here's a quote from the GOP lawyers in their petition. In-person voting at the polls on a fixed date, Election Day, is the only constitutional manner of voting in Arizona. The lawsuit comes amid GOP efforts on many fronts. Yes, by imprisoning black women in Tennessee, by retrenching on making voting more widely available in the wake of COVID. GOP efforts on many fronts to remake the system for casting and counting votes as former President Donald Trump repeats the lie that he lost the 2020 election because of fraud. It is modeled on a similar lawsuit in Pennsylvania, where a court in January struck down the state's 2-year-old mail voting law. Democratic Governor Tom Wolf's administration has appealed to the state Supreme Court there. Several bills introduced in the Arizona state legislature aim to eliminate or severely restrict mail balloting. Though some look unlikely to succeed due to opposition from one or more Republicans. Lawmakers voted Monday to put a question on the 2022 ballot that, if approved, would require voters to write their birthday, either a driver's license number or social security number on mail ballots starting in 2024. You want to write the same thing that you type in as a security code on half the things you log into on the internet? Like when you go to a bank or a credit card, you have to put your social security number there. You are going to go to a public place in a ballot box and do that? That's insane. The GOP did not challenge absentee voting for members of the military, which the state is required to allow by federal law. In 2020, 90% of Arizona voters used a ballot that arrived in the mail and can be returned through the U.S. Postal Service, because they're sane. If the voters in Arizona, by and large, are sane, and they want to vote conveniently, and they want to vote. There has been no widespread fraud in the state of Arizona. Period. Get over it. Get over it. Let people vote. Let my people go to wherever they want to vote. Let them use an envelope, lick a stamp. I guess people don't lick stamps anymore. I'm dating myself. At any rate, the fight goes on. We shall prevail. We shall fight them at the ballot box. We shall fight them in the courts. We shall fight them at the protests, wherever the need shall arise. We'll win this. In the long term, we'll be victorious. But there may be some dark days in the meantime. We face great challenges, and we have much to overcome. But we shall. I'm Beowulf Rockland. This is Facepalm America. Until next time, thank you for listening. The Sports Psychology Hour with Dr. Andrew Jacobs is a conversation about success in sports and life, coaching, youth sports, and so much more. Listen to athletes, coaches, parents, and just ordinary folks like you who want to achieve and have fun doing it. Now you can support the show at patreon.com/sportspsychologyhour. Get access to ad-free content and exclusive Patreon-only episodes. Just go to patreon.com/sportspsychologyhour. That's patreon.com/sportspsychologyhour.